Today we're going to I'll just run back a slide, sorry. So yeah, I'm Paul Heaney, CISO at Proof ID, and today we're going to look at how to automate the testing of your IAM platform. So first of all, we're going to look at what the challenges are that you face as an organisation, and then we're going to actually look at how we can then take that forward and look at how we can describe the user, how we can actually automate the testing of that. So that comes into a number of parts. So first of all, we've actually got to define what are we testing, what is the experience that the user should have. We're then going to look at how do we take that definition of what the user experience is and prove that. And we're then going to actually look at then, that's great, we've got some testing around that, how we're actually going to build that into your deployment pipeline and automate that. So kind of skip the introduction slightly. Should say as well, this is based on some real world experience, some projects I've been involved in over the course of the last few years. So it comes from some real world experience in a large user facing deployment. So first of all, the challenge, a lot of this is true for both IAM and SIAM, but a lot more, some of these are more prevalent in a SIAM deployment. So identity has a large number of integration points. So you might think in a customer deployment, from an external perspective, we're protecting one application. So take a bank as an example, you're protecting online banking. Well, actually, the customer is integrating in multiple places. So there's not only the login, so how do they log into their online banking and access their accounts, but there's the user registration aspect. So how do they come to the bank and give them their credentials, that then gets matched to their account, etc. We've also got all the password reset journeys, the forgotten account details, all the unhappy paths, so people, perhaps their account's been blocked, and we want to make sure that the way that the user is notified, the way the user is informed, is very sensible, is very clear to the user, and ultimately will improve the user experience and reduce the number of additional contacts, so perhaps having to ring a call centre or go into a branch or a shop. So got a large number of those integration points across the various applications. User experience, we kind of touched on a bit, but user experience is crucial in a customer deployment. That is the unique aspect of what you're selling to your customers. So if it's easy to log in, easy to access your account, easy to interact with the system, then you're going to be a much happier customer. You're not going to necessarily look the same to switch providers, switch to a different bank, switch to a different online store. So user experience is crucial. If that causes a friction to the user, if that causes any problems, so if the user's unable to log in, doesn't get a very clear message, then they're going to start to have a poor experience, which we can get around with testing, but in a customer deployment, we're going to be making a lot more changes. We're going to make changes at a higher rate. We're going to have changes, say, on a weekly or a daily basis even, and we need to make sure that the system that is being deployed to the environment, to production, is actually fit for purpose, is actually meeting all of your requirements and behaves exactly as required. So we've got a lot of changes occurring. So the changes are occurring, sort of being defined, developed and pushed through within a very short period of time. So we might have a 1 week, 1 month development cycle, and we're then pushing change out on a day-by-day basis. And we've said if the user's not able to access their account, they're not able to register, they're not actually able to interact with the organisation, that has a very high impact and causes a lot of distress to the user, a lot of damage to the organisation's reputation. So we need to make sure what is being deployed actually works as expected and meets all the requirements, which we could get around with by actually doing manual testing, but that's going to have a very large overhead. You're going to need to have hundreds of testers, they're going to have lots of test scripts, and it's just not very practical. So these are a lot of the challenges that we face with deploying a new IAM solution. Oops. So we need to automate those testing, but first of all, we need to actually have a very clear understanding from the business of what the requirements are, how the system should operate. So first of all, we need to identify and have a very clear business requirements, and that's not just sort of a user can log in, it's actually what should they see, what should the flow be, and what should the flow be on the unhappy path. So great that a user enters a username and password and can log in if it's a successful credential, but if the password's wrong, what do we do? If their account's locked, what do we do? What's the messaging we give? How do we interact with the customer at that point? And ultimately, we need to actually have the business agree that the business owner, the person responsible for the application, needs to actually sign off and say, yes, these requirements that you have documented or that we have documented together is exactly what I'm expecting from the interaction, from the flow, and that is what we will implement and that is what we will test. So that all sounds very simple, but there's a number of challenges that we face. So first of all, the business owner is not usually technical, that they sort of say, well, I want the user to be able to log in, and they don't really know about all of the other scenarios that might happen. So what about a user that's not registered, or a user that's registered but been blocked or has changed the name? So they typically define the requirements differently. They will have different terminology that they will use. So we need to both be on the same page. We need to ensure clarity across all parties and actually have agreement. So it's all well and good saying the business of these requirements, but then the developers and the test team go and implement something different, that we all have to be working on the same page, working to the same implementation, working to the same end goal. So ultimately then, we have to take the user experience, take those requirements and translate those into a scenario that is testable. So first thing we need to do is, we've got a new project, is actually take the business speak user requirements, user experience, and convert that into something that we can test. So we've got to go through this example with a fairly basic, I know sort of we've talked a lot in this conference about passwordless login, but from a simple case that everybody understands, everyone's probably got a very clear view on, we've got to take the requirement of a user being able to log in. So the business owner says, well, we want a registered user, a registered customer, to be able to log in and access their account. So that seems, it's a fairly clear statement, but how do we actually test that? How do we know what the success criteria is, and how do we know when we have met that requirement? So that leads us on to actually describing the user experience. So we need to set out a series of user stories that define the user experience. So there's a number of ways to do this, and we've got to look at one we use called behavioural driven development, and actually look at creating those user stories and setting those out. So we've got a scenario here. See if we can get the laser to work. Perfect. So we've got we've set out initially, so we create a description for what we're trying to achieve. So here it's in sort of clear English that both the IT teams can understand and the business. So got the description. So as an existing registered customer, so we're very clearly defining sort of the prerequisites. I want to be able to use my login credentials so that I can access my account. So we know what this story is testing. So there's a number of scenarios that we could have here. So we start out, we define scenario 1. So we give scenario 1 a sort of a brief summary. So here we're entering good details. We then sort of set out the prerequisites. So using sort of the keyword given. So given I'm an unauthenticated user, so I don't have a current session with the organisation, and the following criteria apply. So given these four items, so I'm unauthenticated, I'm viewing the login screen, so that's where the user is currently, that they've entered a valid username, and that they've entered a valid password. So we're testing a happy path here. We've then got the action. So here we've just got a single action. I select the login. So click on the login button. That could perhaps actually be clear. It could say I select the login button, or I select a button labelled login. Then we've got what the user will experience. So we've got here sort of I should have a new secure session created for me, so something that has happened. I should be able to see my account portal homepage, and I should see the recent transactions. So it's very clear from a testing perspective that when I've entered some valid credentials, I'll select login, then what am I seeing? I should see the valid transactions. I shouldn't see an error page. I shouldn't see a page that perhaps displays a picture of a cat. So that's very easy from a tester to be able to actually review and say, yep, that's the correct criteria. Very easy for a business owner to actually say, yes, this is the experience that I would expect. But then we start to get into the unhappy paths. So entering an incorrect password. So again, I'm unauthenticated. I'm viewing the login screen, and I'm viewing. I've entered a valid username, but an incorrect password, and I select the login button again. So at this time, should see an error message on the login screen, and we should see a text. So invalid credentials, please check username and password. So what will the user experience? What will the user see? But then also some back-end items. So the failed login count for the user should be increased by 1. And ultimately, at the end, the user should be able to retype their credentials. So very clear, very easy to be able to actually define those and have them agreed by the business. Next, we need to take those and prove them. So we need to prove these for a number of reasons. So we want to automate these, as we kind of laid out earlier. So crucially, the purpose is to verify the functionality of what we release is actually fit for purpose, it is actually correct, and meets all the business requirements. So we want to build that into our development pipeline to ensure that gets run at every stage and is run before deployment through the route to live. There's a number of items here that we need to test. So we've got web applications that we're going to need to test. We've got APIs. We've got single-page apps. So there's a number of challenges here that we need to run through. So in our case, we're using a number of tools. All of these are sort of available and open source. So we've got we're using Cucumber to define and document the user stories in a way that can then be analysed, actually see which stories are failing, which steps are failing, and report that in a sensible manner. We're using Selenium to interact with the web browser, so actually create an instance of the web browser and simulate those user clicks. So clicking on the login button, entering the credentials, and then checking what appears on screen is as expected. So we know that it meets the requirements of the business. We've then using JUnit to tie that together to actually run those tests and bring those results together to say, yep, that's passed, that's failed. And JUnit is also great. JUnit is also great because we can then test any of the API applications. So we use Selenium for HTTP web-based applications, and we're using the JUnit for any REST-based APIs. Got that integrated with Maven as a step on the build process, so we can very easily run that at every point. And that's then all integrated using Jenkins to actually build that into in on every commit and make sure that that's fully part of the development pipeline. So whilst we're primarily using Java, a lot of these tools are available, or variants of these tools are available for other platforms. So even if you're a Python shop or C# or whatever, then there are tools available very similar to these that can actually allow us to build those tests. So first thing we need to do is take our user stories and convert those into what are called Cucumber feature files. So these are the files that Cucumber reads to actually see what are the steps that need to be executed. So you see that a lot of this has a very similar syntax to the user stories. There's a couple of slight differences, but on the whole they are very similar. So here we see we've got our features, so the description from before, so being able to actually log in, and we've got our scenario. We've got our steps, so we've got our prerequisites, and again we're using given and. The slight difference is that these are in camel case rather than in uppercase. We've got our site to login, and then we've just defined sort of on the success criteria that actually the URL we should see. So in the previous the user story said we should see the account page. We've just converted that slightly further in the Cucumber files to actually list the URL. So I'm not going to go through both the happy and the unhappy path because I think that would just be duplicating content. So we then need to take the test scenarios and actually automate those. So this is where we get onto the JUnit and the Selenium section. So here we've got our Selenium WebDriver. So we've got our before annotation here. So we've got the things we've got to do to set that up. So that will tie onto the before steps of. Just sets up the sets up our web browser. So here we're just using the Gecko driver. So we're setting up a Firefox instance. We then on this slide on this section get onto actually each of the individual steps that we're going to perform. So you'll see here we've got our keywords, so we've got our given annotation, and then we've got IAM unauthenticated. That matches onto the given step of the Cucumber file. So when this is all run together, it says, okay, I've got to the given IAM unauthenticated. This is the method that I will run. So we run the sort of delete all cookies in this case to ensure that we are unauthenticated. We then say I'm viewing the login screen, so we go to the login screen. We've then got our next step, so I enter a valid username. So we find an element called user identifier input, so the username field on that form. That's the login form that I took this from, and we enter the username of fred@example.com. Next, we do the same with the password. So we find the password field and we enter the password. So fairly straightforward. We then get on to actually doing the action. So yeah, there's a step missing actually there, clicking the input button. So we then check our success criteria. So I should have a new session. So in this dummy app, we've kind of just got a cookie named session. Then got the next step. So should see an account portal homepage on the URL of example.com/accounts. And we then do that by checking that the current URL that the web browser is on is that URL. And finally, we're checking to see are we viewing the recent transaction. So we look for an element on that page with the ID of transactions and check the text in there says my transactions. So all fairly straightforward. In a real case, and typically these will have many more steps. I've just abbreviated some of the JUnit and the Selenium steps of navigating around, so it fits on a slide. I wasn't brave enough to do a demo with a full set of test cases. I thought we've got to run into all sorts of issues with the demo gods, so I went for the safe and cowardly option of using PowerPoint. So we've created our test. We've created our Cucumber file. We then run that. So as part of running Maven test, it finds the feature. Oops, back a slide. it finds the step, so we've got the feature of log into the account. We've got our scenario, so enter the good details. So I'm unauthenticated, so that's passed successfully because it's in green. Viewing the login screen, we move on to those pages. We enter the credentials. We then click on the login button and then check to see, do we have a new secure session created? So that's passed, it's in green. And we then look at, am I on the correct URL? So here, I thought it'd be a bit exciting and enter an invalid password for the test. And in this case, it's failing on the next step because, actually no, that one should have failed, shouldn't it? I've not entered an invalid password, entered the correct password, but it's redirecting to the wrong URL. So the session's been created, but the URL been redirected to is not the example.com account, it's actually the BBC. So something's obviously gone wrong, some very bad experience has happened now would have happened for the user, but because we've got the test here, we can see that there's clearly a problem here, the test has failed, we need to then start to investigate what's wrong in our configuration. And then we skip the rest of the tests. So we see very nicely at the end that of our one scenario that we've run, one scenario failed, and of the 8 steps that we had, 1 failed, 1 was skipped, and 8 were passed. So we know exactly the success criteria. So that's great. We can build that into our we've got our test defined. All the hard work has now been done. We've taken our user stories, converted those into tests, and we could then build that into our development pipeline. So typically, in a large number of organizations, or the application you're going to be integrating with are going to be fairly large, fairly complex, and you're probably not going to be able to run those in Docker on your laptop or on your AWS instance, that you're going to want to actually stub those. So I would typically see that in the lower environments, so sort of your CD, your managed dev environments, that you will be having stubbed instances of your back-end applications, back-end interfaces that return enough data to actually allow the tests to run, that simulate those applications but without being the fully featured app. In the later stage of the environment, then you'd obviously want to test against the real applications, but you don't really want to overburden the testing at each stage, but you want to make sure there's enough testing and sufficient testing to actually know that the IAM solution that you have developed, you've deployed, is actually working as expected. So this is where sort of Jenkins fits in very nice, so that we can have that actually run at each stage. So we might be initially having your developers run it locally with a Docker instance and Maven test, and then on commit, we've got sort of, it gets tested in dev, and then as that then gets promoted up through to test, pre-production, production, etc., then we can run a series of tests very quickly on the deployed solution and ensure that what appears on screen, what appears to the user, what the user experience is, actually matches the requirements that the business has set out. So reduces all of that testing required, allows the business to move much faster and be confident that the solution that's being promoted into production is actually what was expected and isn't going to affect the user. So with that and 45 seconds to spare, questions?
So with the MFA being such a common theme around here, how do you automate MFA testing in these scenarios?
That's, a challenge. Depends on the MFA solution that you're deploying. So with a number of customers then in sort of, in our lower environments, we've actually stubbed out the MFA solution. So if it's a sort of token-based sort of TOTP, SMS approach, then actually having a stub interface that we actually do a separate call to generate a new TOTP that we can then insert into the screen. If it's a push notification, then that's much clearly much more difficult. So yeah, that's a challenge that we've not had to face with the customers we've deployed with so far, that the approach they've used for MFA hasn't required that yet. But yeah, that's an up-and-coming challenge, I think, that it might be a case of perhaps stubbing that or having a flag to allow that step to be skipped in the testing case, but we do want to be able to test that. So yeah, it's a good future step.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.